wasting hundreds of millions of euro in subsidies for developers and investment funds, and we need to invest this money instead in directly building housing that is genuinely affordable.
Thank you, Deputy O'Callaghan. Now we move to solidarity, people before profit. Deputy Boyd Barrett is sharing with his colleagues, Deputy Murphy and Deputy Barry.
Yeah, I think I'm getting 25 minutes and 10 and 10. Well, the senior ministers who delivered the budget have scuttled off. We did them the courtesy of listening to their diatribe of propaganda to justify their budget, but they couldn't do us the courtesy of listening to our response. But I suppose that sort of says everything about this government, because they just don't listen. But I can tell you, the people will not be fooled by this budget. Despite all the leak strategy, all the spin, all the interviews, no doubt they're doing where they're trying to sell this budget, the people will not be fooled. And the truth about this budget is very, very simple. It is hopelessly inadequate. It is pathetic for the most part, and at times it is downright insulting in terms of dealing with the problems that ordinary working families and vulnerable people and pensioners and students are dealing with out there. The truth about this budget is that the government have decided to unload the cost of the COVID pandemic on working people rather than ask the very wealthy and the corporations who did extremely well during the pandemic to pay their contribution towards the bill for the COVID pandemic. That is the truth about this budget. And it's obvious when you look at the round and you even look at the government figures. A totally insulting €5 a week for pensioners and social welfare recipients. That's a 2% increase as against inflation, which is running at just under 4%. But in addition to that, you can add the energy price hikes, the carbon tax increases that are coming down the road, the local property tax increases, all of which fall much more heavily and disproportionately on the less well-off and on working families. So you are asking, through inflation, ordinary working people to pay the bill for the COVID pandemic so that your wealthy friends and your corporate friends can continue to live on the pig's back. That is the truth of this budget. The housing issue, which of course is the major issue that we are facing in this country, where the government has failed consistently in successive governments to do the basic thing of put an affordable roof over people's head. And the government have been trumpeting a figure of €4 billion in exchequer funding to go to housing. But when you actually look at the budget, there is some additional money for capital expenditure in housing, but it is nowhere near the €4 billion figure. It's just not in the budget. And in fact, the additional money you have put into the housing budget will be more than accounted for by the rising inflation costs in building materials in the construction sector at the moment, and will end up at similarly abysmal delivery figures in terms of social and genuinely affordable housing to the ones that have brought us to the desperate housing crisis that we are currently in. And all of that because the government just doesn't want to break from its addiction to filling the pockets of the corporate landlords. So even after all the talk of a step change in terms of housing policy and the direct delivery of public and affordable housing by the government itself, next year 14,000 new HAP tenancies, 13,000 new public and affordable homes, if the latter are even delivered. That's the truth. No change. The big money continues to pile into the pockets of the corporate landlords, with 66,000 people taken off housing lists as if the problem has been solved, but in actuality, in insecure tenancies, paying extortionate rents with public money pouring into the pockets of the corporate landlords. That is the truth of what's going on in housing. The vacant, the zoned land levy, which is a nod to the urgent need to deal with the rampant land hoarding and speculation of the property investors and of the big property developers, an utterly pathetic and meaningless gesture, where we replace the vacant site levy, which was a 7% annual charge on sites that should have been used to deliver public and affordable housing, replaced with a 3% charge, which will not come into force until 2024. So that all the shenanigans that allowed them to get around the vacant site levy in any event, and which made it completely meaningless and ineffective, they will be able to do in terms of this new levy, which in any event is simply a fraction of the enormous profits they are making just by sitting on empty properties and vacant land as they watch the value of their assets climb through the roof. And again, this is not rhetoric. You look at the central bank's recent quarterly figures on net household wealth, and they are staggering beyond belief. The accumulation of wealth in the last year in the hands of the richest in our society is simply beyond the comprehension of anybody. The figures are so staggering. We now have national household wealth that jumped 89 billion last year to a record 883 billion euro. And the 5% of the richest people in this country who own all those land banks and property banks, 85,000 people, have between them 331 billion euro. That gives them an average household income of 3.8 million, and rising and rising and rising. But no wealth taxes on that, no capital gains tax on that accumulation of profits, and all the rents that they're generating on those extortionate rents they're charging to people who can barely afford to put the roof over their head. They're not asked to pay the bill for COVID, but ordinary people are who are struggling to pay the rent. And with the housing crisis continuing to spiral out of control. And I'll tell you, I'll give you the simplest of contrasts. If those big macro figures on household wealth boggle the mind, and they do boggle the mind, and of course that's why they're never debated. Because people don't look at this stuff. The shadow budgets of the accumulation of the wealth of the rich and the tax reliefs, which are never discussed on budget day, but which amount to 17 billion euro in corporate tax expenditures every year, which if you go and look at these little fine tables on the revenue are described, and they are costs to the exchequer. Public money, 17 billion euro going in tax breaks to the big corporations. But if all of that is too mind-boggling, here's a simple contrast. The Special Assignee Relief Programme, tax break. A tax break only available to those who have salaries higher than 75,000 euro, but up to millions of euro. There are 50 people, for example, in receipt of SARP, according to a document that the Minister for Finance helpfully provided to us this morning, earning in excess of €1 million, and they get a tax break of 30%. 30% of the income they earn between 75,000 euro and €1 million is not taxed at all. And they get reliefs to send their children to private schools and to go on trips back to America or Britain or wherever it is. Imagine that. Imagine a particular relief only for those with the highest of high incomes, including millionaires, that is not given to ordinary workers. But that figure, people should just consider it. 38.2 million to the highest earners in the ongoing SARP relief. How much given additional to mental health this year? 36 million. All the people suffering from the mental health crisis, which it worsened exponentially over the last year, yet less than 1,500 of the wealthiest earners in this country. Tens of thousands of people suffering the mental health crisis, and this government gives them 38 million this year, gave them 42 million last year, and it will continue to do it for years ahead, but only 36 million for those additional money for mental health services that are chronically underfunded. That even with this increase, less than 6% of the health budget will be going on mental health when the World Health Organization has said it should be 12%. You would need an additional €1 billion to reach what are the World Health Organization's recommended levels of health expenditure on mental health, and you give a miserable 36 million, but you give more than that to 1,500 of the best paid executives. Or here's another contrast with the same amount of money. How much do the students get in additional grants? We have nearly 250,000 students in this country, and they got 35 million extra in the budget. Nearly 80,000 students in receipt of SUSI grants, but 80,000 students get less extra from this budget than 1,500 of the best paid executives in the country. That says it all. That says it all about this government's priorities. Line the pockets of the rich with tax reliefs, while working people are asked to pick up the bill for COVID and will be struggling, as students are, to put a roof over their head, or sleeping on couches, or elderly and vulnerable people shivering in the cold and making decisions to turn off the heat because they haven't got enough money to buy food. But you think it is okay to give more to millionaire executives in this budget of public money than to give to those vulnerable people. It is nothing short of shameful. And there are some other stuff that are worth looking at in this budget, which, because I'm a nerd, I love going through the estimates books where you get the truth of what's actually going on, as against all the grand statements, the propaganda and the spin. The Greens, who are going to save the climate. What's actually happened? Less money for forestry this year than last year. And our level of afforestation to address the climate crisis is abysmal. We haven't hit our forestry targets for decades. They are so far short of what was recommended by COFORT nearly a decade ago, absolutely abysmal, but 99 million allocated last year for forestry, 96 million this year. An actual fall in the investment in afforestation. Transport capital budget, sustainable mobility, carbon reduction and public transport. Last year, 2.4 billion allocated. This year, 900 million allocated. A dramatic reduction in the capital investment in public transport and climate-related transport. So it seems, Count Corla, we got the cycle lanes and that's it. That's what we're getting in terms of radical transport measures to address the climate crisis, to increase the capacity of our public transport system in order to take people out of their cars. No money for the additional buses we need in the bus fleet to provide more public service routes in this city, in rural areas in particular. No significant increase, in fact, a dramatic reduction. Similar reduction in the climate action and environment leadership heading, a big drop in the amount of money allocated in that. Arts and culture, the people who carried us through the pandemic, in terms of the music we listened to, the films we watched in streaming, all of that, and who are absolutely hammered with the public health measures and restrictions which they are still affected by. What was the budget for 2021 for current expenditure on arts? 65 million. What's the budget for 2022 for the arts? 65 million. Not a cent extra. All the lip service, all the rhetoric of how much we care about our arts workers, our entertainment workers, our musicians, Not a cent extra in the current expenditure budget. And one could go on. ICU. I mean, you would think after the COVID pandemic, you would realise the absolute critical, urgent imperative of getting the intensive care capacity of this country up to at least the European average level. But what will happen after this budget? We will still be below half of the intensive care capacity level of the rest of Europe, where we have just under 6 ICU beds per 100,000 of population, whereas the average in Europe is 12 ICU beds, twice what we have. And you go to countries like Germany and other countries, and they have multiples of that. And people should understand the implications of that. If we are compelled back into further lockdowns, it will be because our health service, and particularly our critical care capacity, is not adequate to deal with a public health emergency. But is there an increase to bring it up to the sort of levels where we could potentially cope with a public health emergency? No, and the details aren't clear in this budget as to what's the situation with our public health teams, but just to remind people, the public health teams you need to cope with these sort of public health emergencies were 1/3 of the recommended staffing levels before COVID, and there is no sign that they will be brought up to the recommended levels of staffing from what I can see. Some marginal increase in recruitment in some areas, but still way, way short of what is necessary. The budget boasts about additional money going into the health budget overall, but again, when you take into account medical inflation, it'll be more or less wiped away, and demographic changes mean we have an older population, we have more vulnerable people using the health service, and we are so far short of the capacity necessary in order to clear the waiting list of nearly 1 million people on waiting lists, waiting for procedures, some of them waiting 2 and 3 years for vital procedures, and nowhere near. And you look at what's happening in hospitals in the week that we are talking, where there is 20 and 30% staff deficits in many of the ED units. And the overcrowding that we had pre-COVID is coming back, and coming back with a vengeance. And to be honest, I'm sure every TD, including the minister sitting over there, is hearing the horror stories starting to come back again of people sitting, elderly, vulnerable people sitting in ED units for hours and hours and hours and hours and not being seen because the staff are absolutely overrun. They're completely demoralised because we haven't given the capacity, we haven't recruited the staff. And why are we unable to recruit the staff? Why are the student nurses, after they qualify, running out of the country? Running out of the country in large numbers. Why do more than 70% of them want to leave after they qualify? Because you won't pay them on placement, and then when they do qualify, they can't afford the rent because you won't control the rents. And you can't deliver the public and affordable housing, and there is nothing in this budget to suggest that you're serious about it. And to be honest, I mean, it's sort of something. I was asked by the Students' Union UCD to go and speak at the protest tomorrow that'll be happening outside Dublin City Council after the absolutely shocking comments of Owen Keegan. But you see, it's not just about Mr. Keegan. It is about the marketisation of housing, even down to the level of student accommodation. You know, we warned that when that expensive student accommodation was being built, and many others did too, not just us, when that expensive student accommodation was being built by investment firms, that no ordinary student could afford it, and it would end up as the tenements of the future. And that's what's going to happen. Change of use now being given for that student accommodation. Thousands of students have nowhere to go. They can't afford that, but we'll give them change of use to turn it into something else so they can make profit. No problem. And what change of uses will come after that on all these developments that have shot up all over the place in order to ensure that these investors can make their pound of flesh off the back of the housing crisis and the market, the property market in this country that has gone out of all control. But it is a feeding frenzy for the rich, an absolute feeding frenzy for the people who own multiple properties. I mean, one thing we suggest in our alternative budget, among many things, to redress the inequality in how these things are treated. The people are getting their property tax bills through the letterbox at the moment, and many people are quite worried about the increases they're seeing, about the increased valuation of their property on a roof that is just their roof, their family roof over their head. And I tell you, the anger is beginning to build on this one, Minister. Very, very worried people on very low incomes, seeing significant increases in many cases in the property tax they're going to be charged. Now, wouldn't a simple measure, not to punish people for the roof that's over their head, to abolish the property tax on the principal private residence and levy it instead on people who have multiple properties? Because by definition, if you have 2 properties or 3 properties or 10 properties, you can manage to pay a property tax. But if it's just your family roof over your head and you're reliant on a pension and your energy costs are going through the roof, how the hell are you supposed to pay it? But no, even that simple measure, and you could cover, and we cost it in our alternative budget, we've done it every year for multiple years, but in this year of all years, we should be thinking about that when we see what's happening in the property sector. That would be a fair measure, to claw back some of the extortionate profits that are made from people who have multiple properties, who are renting them out at extortionate rents to people who are struggling on basic incomes or on very low incomes, and not punish them with additional taxes and charges on the roof over their head. So, thanks to Minister English for at least having the courtesy to be here, but it really is a pity that the senior ministers who deliver the budgets wouldn't listen to the spokespeople from all the other party groups who listen to them in terms of delivering their budget. But as I said, the simple summary of this budget is the vast majority of working people will be worse off at the end of next year after this budget, because you have done nothing to address the spiralling cost of living, the spiralling cost of accommodation and other price hikes that people are suffering. The wealthy will continue to get wealthier. So it's the same old for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Look after the people at the top, but ordinary people will pay the price. But people will not be fooled. They will see through this budget for what it is. €5, 0.5% in increases. It's insulting. People know it's insulting, and you will feel the wrath of people, particularly after COVID, because there's no reward. It's not only is there not a reward, you've actually punished them for the huge effort and sacrifice and endurance that people showed during the course of the pandemic, and you've now asked them to pay the bill with a completely unjust budget.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. The government's spin is that this is a back-to-normal budget after COVID. And yes, it is. Back to the capitalist normal of reliance on the market, which means a further deepening of the housing crisis when rents are completely out of control, when prices are going through the roof, and when there are 10,000 people homeless. It means a further growth of the hospital waiting lists, with already close to 1 million people on them, while public money continues to be funneled to private healthcare. And it means continuing to fiddle while the world burns and climate catastrophe approaches. During COVID, the government was forced to take action that it previously said couldn't be done. It was forced, given the inadequacies of our own public healthcare system, to take the private healthcare system into the public system, although of course they did it at extortionate and outrageous cost. They were forced, something that they said not only couldn't be done, but something they said was unconstitutional, to have a rent freeze and a ban on evictions. And they were forced to introduce a PUP at a level designed that people could actually survive on. But now it's back to normal. Payments for carers, for pensioners, for unemployed people at a level below the poverty line. It's National Fiver Day. The government wants a pat on the back for giving all these vulnerable groups of people a fiver. But the irony is, in the minister's own speech, he admits that the inflation rate is going to be 3.7%. And so the government is not giving people a fiver. You can do the maths yourself. People are on a payment of just over €200. A €5 increase is an increase of 2.5%. What's being given to people is less than the rate of inflation. And so what the government is imposing on carers, on pensioners, on unemployed is a cut. A cut in real terms is contained in this budget. On housing, we've returned to the normal. Rule by landlords for landlords. There is literally nothing here for renters. Not a single item in the budget for renters. Whereas on the other side, for big landlords, for developers, we have a full suite of tax breaks. We have an extension, yet again, of the Help to Buy scheme, better called the Help to Profit scheme, a scheme that was originally inserted, lobbied for by the CIF, by the construction industry, designed simply to push up prices and put money into the pockets of private developers, extended yet again. You have an extension of the pre-letting expenses relief for landlords, another tax relief for landlords. And most horrifying of all is the pathetic zoned land tax. Fianna Fáil campaigned in the general election on the basis of increasing the vacant site tax to 14% from the 7% that it's currently at. They come to power, they have the Ministry of Housing, and then instead of following through on their promise to double it from 7% to 14%, they cut it. They cut it from 7% to 3%. What is it they say about campaigning in poetry and governing in prose? It's a pretty generous way of describing the gap between the promises and the reality, which is going to put more money into the pockets of speculators and developers and will not incentivise at all land hoarders to give up the land, because the 3% is not only below inflation, it's substantially below the increase in land prices, and therefore there is no incentive at all for these people to stop land hoarding. On healthcare, the big headline is the government's going to increase the number of ICU beds by 19. 19, fair play to you. We have one of the lowest rates of ICU beds in the OECD per 100,000 people. It was one of the reasons we had such long, extended lockdowns. We were badly exposed to COVID. Our healthcare system was. An extra 19 is going to still leave us right at the bottom of that table. It's completely inadequate. The government will try to make much of an extra €37 million for mental health. Weigh that against the extra billion plus that is actually required if we're to reach the WHO recommended level of 12% of our overall health budget. It's pathetic. But yet what's happening at the exact same time, contained in the very same budget, is an extra €50 million to go to the National Treatment Purchase Fund. In other words, more money that will go out of the public system and into the private system, as opposed to investing in building a national health service free at the point of use, which is what we need. On climate, it's quite an incredible line from Minister Donoghue. He said, studies have shown that carbon taxation is likely to be the single most effective climate policy which can be pursued by government. He has no source or citation or anything like that whatsoever to back up that ridiculous, untrue, non-evidence-based notion. Actually, the evidence is quite clear. Carbon taxes have been introduced in multiple jurisdictions. One study looked at 19 jurisdictions. They found the impact in terms of carbon emissions was modest at best, and they also significantly found that if you rely on that measure, it will take 110 years to do what's necessary. We don't have 110 years, we have 10 years. Really, a country like Ireland should be hitting zero carbon emissions by 2030. But it's a regressive measure Even the SRI admits that it's a regressive measure that will hit working class people hard, makes their lives harder in a context where people don't have, in many circumstances, an alternative. But really this nonsense idea that studies have shown it's the most likely to have an impact, it's an excuse. It's an excuse for not doing what's necessary. It's an excuse for not standing up to the big polluters in this country, not standing up to big agribusiness. It's an excuse for not standing up to the fossil fuel industry. It's an excuse to not dramatically shifting policy and implementing the kind of radical eco-socialist policies that are necessary, ultimately a democratically planned economy to have the rapid transition that we need. And instead what we have, in addition to the carbon tax, is the very definition of a half measure. Half-price public transport for 19 to 23-year-olds. I mean, I really think, in the face of climate catastrophe that we're facing, with the Greens in government, it's just pathetic. What we need, and we've been arguing for it for years and years and years, and including it in our budget statement, what we need is free, green and frequent public transport. And there's no reference in either of the ministers' speeches to the biodiversity crisis, not one. And is that any surprise? Because the government, yet again, is going to fund the greyhound industry more than they fund the National Wildlife and Parks Service. They're going to give 19 million euros to the greyhound industry. Absolutely incredible. I have to say my jaw almost hit the floor when it was announced that the government is giving an extra 63 million euros tax break to the banks. With KBC and Ulster Bank pulling out of the Irish market, laying off thousands of workers, the government is going to give them a parting gift of an exemption from the bank levy. I wonder what sort of lobbying took place. On what basis is it justified to say you don't have to pay the 63 million euros that otherwise you'd have to pay? 63 million will be enough to abolish all inpatient and emergency department charges for public patients. It would be enough to hire 100 speech and language therapists and 100 psychologists and 100 OTs and 100 physiotherapists and still have enough left over to restore housing adaptation grants to 210 levels. But instead of improving our health services and supporting people with disabilities, the government is striving to give another tax break to the banks. Back to the normal, all right, in terms of the approach of this government. The government made a choice in this budget, and that is a choice to protect the rich. Every year, People Before Profit proposes a millionaire's tax on the assets of the super rich, and every year Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael reject it. This year, the millionaire's tax would raise more than ever before, and that's because the amount of wealth held by the millionaires in this country is more than ever before. Household wealth increased by almost 90 billion in 1 year. It's now almost 900 billion. The top 5% of that, all millionaires, have almost 40% of that, over 350 billion between them. A millionaire's tax, a 2% tax on assets over €1 million, would provide enough money to fund free college education for all, free school meals in every school nationwide, free public transport for all, as well as reducing the pension age to 65 and building 10,000 extra homes. The point is that the wealth is there, but to build these universal public services, we'll need to kick out the government and fight for a left government committed to eco-socialist change. Finally, I want to just comment on the promises around free contraception, because I think the fine print attached to this proposal is quite scandalous. After years of saying it couldn't be done, the government has agreed to fund free contraception. But then you look at the fine print, and what the government is doing is sneaking in disgraceful and sexist restrictions upon that measure. According to what was announced today, free contraception will only be available to women under 25. First, Ceann Comhairle, I'm sure this isn't news to you, but people over the age of 25 also have sex and don't all want to have children. But most importantly, why on earth is it being made solely the woman's responsibility to look after contraception? Why is it not, for example, also going to apply to condoms, which not only prevent pregnancy, but also tackle STIs? This should be corrected now, and the free contraception plan should be opened to all. Thank you.
So what did you do this afternoon? You tweaked the system a little bit. You gave a few crumbs from the table. But the rich will stay rich, and the poor will stay poor, and many will die preventable deaths, frozen in their homes this winter. Let's start with that. An extra £5 on the fuel allowance, 28 weeks, total €140. Now we know that because of market madness, energy costs are due to rise very sharply. They're already rising. €500, maybe €1,000 over a year. So for every extra €5 or €6 that the low-income household has to fork out, the government plan through this budget to compensate them to the tune of €1. Minister, this country has the highest, what is called, excess winter death rate in Europe. More than 1,500 people every year. What's meant by that, as I understand it, is the number of people who die over the winter months as opposed to what the average number of people who die over an average 3 months in the course of the year. But those people are not killed by cold alone. They are killed by fuel poverty. And your measly measure will not lift people out of fuel poverty. The increase in the fuel allowance should be at least 3 times what the government have brought in today. Should be at least €15 per week. Now, when the pandemic arose, it was determined that the minimum that an unemployed worker made unemployed by the pandemic should live on would be €350. But as the pandemic recedes, you're driving back to the same old, and your budget says that the unemployed worker should be able to survive on a little over €200 per week. So now we have National Fiver Day. That €5 increase is less than the rate of inflation. So your government is cutting the incomes of people on social welfare. You are cutting the living standards of the poorest people in this society. The low-paid received enormous praise, including from the government, during the pandemic. Our heroes and heroines in retail, our cleaners, our home helps, people in nursing homes, etc., took risks to take this society through the pandemic on wages that were hardly sufficient to pay the rent. There was an opportunity in this budget for a lasting COVID bonus for those workers. You could have implemented a national minimum wage of €15 per hour. Instead, you chose a measly 30 cents per hour. That'll be wiped out, more than wiped out, by the rent increases alone. There's only one other society in the entire OECD with a larger percentage of its workforce low paid than here in Ireland. The government seems determined to keep it that way. I would appeal to low paid workers to organise. If the government are not in this budget prepared to intervene from above to abolish the scandal of low pay, workers should organise from below to end it, and I would encourage them to do so. 50% public transport for 19 to 23-year-olds. Welcome enough in its own right, but is it enough? No, not nearly enough. Half price is a half measure. This is not the time for half measures. We have a climate emergency. We need emergency action. Emergency action would mean public transport free for all in our society. That's not something that would come cheap. It's not expensive, as many might think it would be. €670 million. That's a step worth taking. It's a price worth paying, and it would be far better than the half measure you've put before us today. Minister, I bet that every property speculator in this country, from one end to the other, let out a loud cheer when they heard the budget speech today. Your zoned land tax being introduced over a period of 2 to 3 years. They couldn't have dreamed you'd be as generous as that. And then when it comes in, that it kicks in at a rate of 3%. That is pathetic. The vacant sites levy is more than double that. at 7%. It's a smack in the mouth for people desperate for affordable housing. It's a gift to the speculators, and it shows, if proof were needed, that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are the parties of the speculators and the rich, and not of working people and the hard-pressed. I want to raise two issues about health. Mental health has been the Cinderella of the health service. 6% of public health spend goes on mental health, less than half the percentage in other European countries. Emerging from the pandemic, we are seeing and will continue to see a tsunami of mental health issues. And your proposal is what? To increase mental health spending, very good, by €37 million. Minister, sitting there, you must be embarrassed. You must realise that that is totally inadequate, and you are failing people who are desperate for help for themselves and for their children. On the issue of sexual health, I think many will take a degree of pleasure from seeing an Irish government introduce a free contraception programme aimed at young people, including teenagers. Who could have imagined that back in the day? But the changes that have led to that have been led by the people, not by the governments. The governments have lagged behind, and you're lagging behind on this one too. Why only 17 to 25-year-olds? Why not other women? And why not men too? Are you saying that contraception is the responsibility solely or first and foremost of women? That's completely wrong. I think you know, Minister, you need to go further on this issue. On the issue of childcare, the Minister said that Budget 22 was a turning point on childcare. It's nothing of the sort. Yes, 75 million extra was injected, but we spend a third of the percentage on GDP that UNICEF recommends for adequate and decent childcare. Last year in this state, 28% of net household income went on childcare. Do you know what the figure was, the equivalent figure in Germany? Minister, it was 1%. So a real turning point would be to meet those UNICEF targets and link that to the establishment of something new, a free public childcare system. Instead, you choose to tinker with the existing system and to prop up a failed privatised market model. The measures won't work. The money is there to pay for all of this. Free public childcare, free Irish National Health Service, free at the point of use, free public transport, and so on. A 2% millionaires tax on the richest 5% in society, even if you were to deduct €1 million for the principal residence in each case, could raise €4.9 billion. Your government has ignored the fact that some corporations have made hugely disproportionate financial gains from this pandemic. Pharmaceuticals is one such industry. Private hospitals is another. Just take those two alone and introduce a levy of 4%. That would raise €800 million. Minister, there's, I'm told, I haven't seen it myself, a programme on Netflix at the moment which has become enormously popular to watch called Squid Game. Set in Korea, but it's about a dog-eat-dog society where people are forced to face off against each other and compete over scarce resources and even results in the deaths of people. Why is this such a popular programme at the moment? Is it just down to people's interest in Korean culture? No, it's because people get it. People get it. That is the reality of life for millions of people in this country, tens of millions in other countries who recognise the reality of a dog-eat-dog capitalist society under the dictatorship of the market. What we're saying on Budget Day here, what I'm saying here on Budget Day is it's not just enough to tax the rich and to spend the money on social projects, important and all as that is. It's also a question of who controls the economy, who controls the levers of the economy, who's in an economically powerful situation to dictate to society. The capitalist market has failed. It's failed on housing. It's failed on childcare. It's failed on energy prices and many more besides. It needs to be ended. We need a socialist alternative, we need a socialist budget, and we need a left government with socialist policies that won't back down from policies of that kind and going right to the end of that particular road.
Thank you.